Your skin here is lined with our stratified squamous dry, and then as you transition inside the body, this is true for, you know, anywhere where there's this opening to the outside, right? The nose, the mouth, the anus, the vagina, all those are going to be going from a dry stratified squamous to a wet stratified squamous because you're inside the body and you need to keep this moist, right? So you're going from this here. And what, if we remember what the whole purpose of a stratified squamous is for protection, right? So that, you know, things go up the nose like a finger up here, right? This area is protected, right? It's, again, it's not going to cause a lot of damage when something's rubbing around in there, right? Fingers go up there. This is a protected area. Once you're inside this area, you're inside the skull, basically, inside there. You're in a protected area. The finger, although nasal swabs can be pushed up through there, normally things aren't going inside your body, right? So now you go to a pseudo-stratified columnar epithelia. That's a much more delicate layer, right? Because it's in a protected area. So let me look at a couple other features, right? Here's the vestibule. Out here, air entering in, there's nose hairs, there's stratified squamous, and then you're into this protected area, right? Here's your eyeballs. This is looking at a horizontal section. And then here is the kind of complex sort of in shape where the air is circulating around, right? Here's another view, right? This is a coronal section inside, right? And here inside the skull, or inside that nasal cavity. And here's the conchi right here. Right? Remember that all those nasal conchi right here and all the linings around here, right, are going to be lined with that pseudo-stratified ciliated columnar epithelia, as well as a thin mucus layer, right? So this is a moist environment. It's got all the cilia around it, so stuff that's circulating around in there can get caught and kind of trapped in there. And it also, because the air is floating around, you know, in this space, right, it can get oxygen. I mean, oxygen is going to be floating around. The air is going to be getting warmed, and it's all, you know, all pollutants and stuff like that can be getting caught inside here. All right. If you are a odorant molecule, right, you can get trapped up in the olfactory epithelium, where you're going to be picked up by receptors, and so that nasal, the olfactory bulb, right, which was up here and kind of dangling down here, kind of detect all those odorant molecules. So those epithelial cells up here are also, remember, lined with the pseudostratified. The receptors, the olfactory cells might be embedded within them. But if these areas are getting infected over here, this is why one of the main symptoms, you know, well, not main, but one of the very telling symptoms of COVID, if somebody loses their sense of smell, right, that's indicating a kind of a bad infection. These cells are infected, and they're being destroyed by the immune system. They're dying, and so these cells within around here are also dying, right? So you get this inflammation process that's going to affect the sense of smell until it's repaired, right? These regenerate, but in the meanwhile, you know, people lose their sense of smell often if it's a bad infection, right? But the big point is that air is swirling around here. Stuff is getting trapped. It's getting warmed. It's getting humidified by that mucus layer. The other thing about the warming part is that this is a very thin layer, right? That's lining it. Remember, it's in the protected body. It's a pseudostratified single layer of cells. And right underneath that membrane, or within the membrane really, is a highly vascularized tissue, right? The connective tissue underneath it, highly vascularized, which means it's bringing in warm blood, which means it's warming the air, right? So warming and humidifying are going to optimize the gas exchange in the lungs, right? So when you breathe in through the mouth, which you sometimes have to do because you need more air, like a bigger, much bigger area for bringing in air, you know, that air is not filtered like this. You're bringing it in through this, which is going to be a stratified squamous that goes right down into your lungs, pretty much unfiltered until it gets over here where it starts getting filtered, right? But this nose stuff, right, when you breathe in through your nose, you're warming it and you're filtering it, as you don't do with your mouth, right? That's why when you can, you're supposed to breathe in through your nose, right? As much as possible. All right, so the other part I'd mention about this vascularization part is this is one reason why inhalation of certain drugs, right, can actually, once it's inside the nasal cavity, if they're permeable into the skin, they can get right into your vasculature right here. Once they're in the vasculature, they can find their way to their targets, right? So if you're snorting, I don't know, say steroids or something like that up the nose, like nasal spray, it's can get very easily into this vascular system over here, right? So that's your nasal cavity. Who knew? It was so much fun, right? All right, so once it goes past the nasal cavity, there's going to be this whole pharynx area right here, commonly, basically your throat, right? At the start of it, in the back of the nasal cavity, still lined with the pseudostratified before you get into the shared digestive region, you have what's called the naso, or nasal pharynx, right? Nasopharynx, right? This basically is from the back of the roof of your mouth right here down to your uvula or soft palate. Over here, this small region right here in red, right? That's going to be lined still with pseudostratified because we haven't entered the digestive tract. And then this next region is also part of the pharynx right here in blue. This is going to be where also food might be if you're swallowing or drink is going to be located. So this has to be, and the region below it have to be a little bit more protected with the stratified squamous epithelia, right? In both of these cases. So as far as filtration goes and everything, like I said, mouth breathing, any air breathing through the mouth has not been filtered yet before it enters the trachea, which can do more filtering, but you lost that nasal cavity, which the main warming and filtration or a major part of it is happening. So you go from the oro, for oral, pharynx to the laryngopharynx for that next region of the larynx right there. And just kind of now, I'm not really so concerned about this, but these two are lined with the stratified squamous. Reason being is when you're swallowing something, right, that could, this area needs to be protected from that stuff. Okay, that's your pharynx, and it's shared, some of it is shared with your digestive region, and then some of it is up here, right? So that's that stratified squamous. Remember that highly protective region? That is it within your vestibule of your nose, as well as the oro and laryngopharynx, right? So you can imagine a question: where is stratified squamous located? And then you can think about where you need protection, right? So as far as the structures, right? You've gone through the nasal cavity, you've seen the nasal conchi or turbinates, and now you're looking at this weird little flap, right? This is what you see when you go and people call it the tonsils. Right, hanging down there. This is going to provide a kind of barrier when you're drinking or eating, right, from food or drink entering into your nasal cavity, right? This area is protected. You don't want like bubbly soda going up into your nasal cavity, right? And so, I know for me, at least when I was a boy, one of our greatest achievements is if you can get your friend to like laugh soda or, milk out their nose, right? So when you're laughing for whatever reason, drink, fluid can get inside your nasal cavity right here, and which will come out your nose eventually, right? So this whole uvula, which normally will seal that area off, happened to fail, right? But its function is to prevent that sort of thing. And then while I'm talking about soda in your nose, you could kind of also, if you've ever done that, you kind of know the burning feeling that you get when there's fluid inside your nose. And that's because that area is not meant to have that stuff in there. Right? It's going to burn it because that more delicate lining versus your stratified squamous. So that's your uvula, and that's function to seal off the nasal cavity. So, once it gets past that area, the food will go down back into the esophagus, and then air is going to go into the next region, this whole larynx area, right, which is going to contain your voice box, the Adam's apple. Right? So it's in between your laryngopharynx and then the next region, the trachea, right? So it's this short section where your voice box is going to be located, right? The hole here that's going to be covered by this flap of tissue, right? Which is made of cartilage, unique pieces of cartilage, as well as these connective tissue bands which form the vocal cords. Right, this largest cartilage right over here is very prominent in guys, right? This Adam's apple, right? That's what you could see moving as somebody talks, that very prominent bulge right there in the throat. And that's the thyroid cartilage of the larynx, right over there. And then the other structure of the larynx is the epiglottis right up here, right? So if the uvula blocks off passage to the nasal cavity, the larynx is going to block off the passage of drink, water, and food going down this way and direct it into the esophagus. So let's take a look at that. And here's the uvula. And then over here, the person swallowing a piece of food, this little flap of elastic cartilage, right? That's made of the same kind of material as your ear, is going to kind of flap down and close off the, entrance way to the windpipe, basically, right? That trachea area. And then once the food is passed, it opens up and allows you to breathe. This is why you can't breathe, when you're swallowing something right there, because the air is stuck up there. If everything's working right. All right, everybody stand there, that epiglottis, and that closes off this lid. This area right over here is called the glottis. This hole basically is called the glottis, and this is the epiglottis. And then right over here is representing the vocal cords. Before I get into that, just look, this picture of these two kind of sealing mechanisms, uvula, epiglottis, right? Just blocking those different passageways, right? And so while we're here, right, what kind of lining is up here? Air only. There's no gas exchange going on. That's all you got to know about it. It's got to be that pseudo stratified columnar epithelia, right? Down here, food. What's happened when you got food? You got a stratified squamous area, right? And now once you get this little area back over here is that laryngopharynx area. But then once you're over here, you're into your larynx area. So what kind of epithelial line here? Air only, no gas exchange. It's going to be that PSCC epithelia. So kind of look at all those, make sure you know what it is and why it might be. All right, so here's your larynx. There's that flap of elastic cartilage right over here. And then this right in the front, your Adam's apple, otherwise known as the piece of cartilage, the thyroid cartilage. That's hyaline cartilage. Here's your laryngeal prominence right over here. Right underneath it, it's going to be important for your voice box, is this bigger circular one called the cricoid cartilage. Right. And then on top of that, there's a couple pieces of smaller cartilage. I don't have the names of them, but they're holding the vocal, they're part of the vocal ligament structure, your voice box structure. Right. So they're going to kind of house the bands of connective tissue that are going to go over to the front of the thyroid cartilage. So here it is from a top view. And here are these things called the retinoid cartilage, but at the ends of them, you got these bands of tissue, connective tissue, ligament type stuff that's going over to the front, and then it covers your glottis, right? This is your passageway to your trachea, to your windpipe, right? This is it without all the surrounding kind of epithelial and connective tissue. This is what it looks like with it, right? So here's the open glottis, and here are those vocal cords right here. And so air, this is just opens and closes based on the air coming out of your lungs. You make all the sounds that you make. And you can Google, you can look at some of this online. I think they have some cool pictures of somebody singing. And you can look at, what their glottis and these vocal cords are doing. So you can see the glottis. This is the epiglottis up here, this flap of tissue that would close over that as you're eating. So just about the voice, I'm not a sound engineer. I don't understand how this happens, but during puberty, guys, they have this enlargement of the larynx, right? That thyroid cartilage, the Adam's apple gets really big. So this whole area gets bigger, your vocal cords. These strips of connective tissue are thicker and longer, which somehow results in a deeper voice. So This is, these are the structures that kind of account for that difference. So that's the voice box, that's the larynx, right? And once that's going through, that's the entranceway into this windpipe right here, right? And you can think of this windpipe as just this big tube. It's kind of like a PVC pipe, right? Always kind of rigid, semi-rigid structure. That is, it's not collapsible like your esophagus behind it, because that's, the nature of air. You don't want it to be collapsible, right? So behind it would probably be over here, but this is the esophagus that's sitting behind it. You notice this is a kind of collapsible muscular tube, right? You can imagine you don't want air having to squeeze through this, right? The trachea is kept open by this rigid piece of these cartilage rings that are going around all down the trachea right here, right? So it's kept open so that air can free flow down through there, right? As opposed to the esophagus, which is going to open and close based on, whether you're swallowing food or not. And it's also going to be able to squeeze that food down that tube, right? Whereas this is just always kept open, again, more like a PVC pipe or something. Right, so there's your windpipe, that's your trachea. Starting, anterior to the esophagus, right? About the base of the larynx, down over here, all the way down, say maybe around your sternum, the bottom of your sternum right there, before it branches off into the lungs right there. You got those C-shaped rings that we just saw in that histology slice running around them. That's going to keep that open right there. At the very bottom of the trachea, you have what's called a carina, the point before it branches. And if any kind of irritants in here, including like fluid or whatever, is going to cause that cough reflex before that stuff enters down into the more delicate tissue of the lungs right there. That's that carina, that highly sensitive spot that causes the cough reflex. So cross section of the trachea, right? This is what we just saw in that histology picture. This is the hyaline cartilage holding it open. The lining of the trachea, the lumen where air is going to be lined with that pseudostratified PSCC epithelia. And in the back of that C ring, right, this horseshoe shaped, goes all the way around. Had this smooth muscle connection called the trachealis muscle. Okay, trachealis muscle. That's not a skeletal, even though it's named. It's smooth muscle, and that is allowed to expansion of the esophagus when you're eating or coughing or something, right? You don't want to, there's no room behind here. This is where the vertebrae are going to be. So it's got to give a little bit of a give, right? So it's not completely lined with the cartilage, right? There's that kind of opening there, which allow a little bit of expansion, right? Constriction to kind of let that expansion happen in the esophagus. And so one of the learning objectives is name this on the bottom right here. What are two adaptations that ensure that the airways will remain open? This is one of them, right? The cartilage rings. And basically all the cartilage plates we'll see down lower too, that can provide a much more rigid structure that are going to keep this tube open, right? As opposed to like a collapsible, say, esophagus, right? Because this is only air. There's not going to be like blood pressure or holding anything open or anything like that. You need to keep it open. All right. So that's the trachea. That's it, right? It's just that windpipe. And then it's going to branch off into the bronchi, right? The left and right bronchi trees, right? They're going to go into the left and right lungs, right? So the trachea is going to split into the main bronchi. And then from there, they're going to branch off into the secondary bronchi. Those are going to branch off into the tertiary, and so on, right? And so these going into the lungs still are kept open by this cartilage, right? So these are open passageway allowing air to flow through. They're also going to be still lined with pseudostratified columnar epithelia, right? But those are just the first branches going into the lungs, right? The bigger ones that still have cartilage rings or cartilage plates, as you can see down here. And then the only other thing I'll mention about the bronchi, the right lung, the going into there is a little bit bigger. The actual bronchi is a little bit wider. It's a little bit less steep, right? So when a kid swallows a marble or something, it gets down by accident into their lungs. it's more likely to go into the right lung. And I've also heard that maybe, smoke and stuff, your right lung's a little more vulnerable to certain diseases because of this just easier passageway, right? All right, so those are bronchi. And before we leave the trachea and the bronchi, right, we know that your nasal cavity is lined with that pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium with the mucus layer. And now your trachea and your bronchi are also lined, right? And so anything that gets in here needs to be like pollutants, coronaviruses, whatever, needs to be removed before entering, deeper into the parts of the lungs, right? And the lungs are going to do that with the mechanism called muco-ciliary transport. Right, so here are your pseudo-stratified ciliated columnar epithelia. Here's the goblet cells that are going to produce mucus. There's also mucus glands in here, right? But this is what's lining your trachea and your bronchi, right? It's also in your nasal cavity, right? But you'll see this layer of mucus that's lining them, right? So stuff, right, that's trapped in here, such as, say, pollutants, so that's floating around in here can get kind of trapped in here along with these little pieces of kind of look like turd or something, but they're not, right? But they're stuff that you breathe in that are getting caught in this layer of mucus and then pushed, right? Pushed alongside by the beating of the cilia out away from the delicate areas of the lungs, right? Because we don't want that bad stuff going into the air sacs, right? Which is much more delicate, right? So things get caught in there and they get pushed out of the lungs in there, right? From this mucus layer right over here. And so that's that muco-ciliary transport, mucus, ciliary, and then pushing stuff way out of the vulnerable areas of the lung. So stuff moving up, getting pushed up, and it's getting either pushed up where it can go down your esophagus. Down here, you could swallow it. The stomach has all sorts of, acidic chyme in there that's going to take care of anything, like bacteria or viruses and stuff. Most stuff can take care of it, or, stuff that can be digestible, right? Or it can be spit out or sneezed out or anything, right? But it's being pushed out, getting away from the vulnerable areas and outside the body in some way. Muco-ciliary transport, right? That's how you get stuff out, right? And then clinically speaking, if you ever heard of cystic fibrosis, kids who have this, they get over congested, right? They have a lot of trouble breathing because they have mucus build up. That mucus is sticky, right? It's more viscous. It doesn't move along that magic carpet ride out of your respiratory tract as easy as it does in a healthy person, because the fluid that's there is more viscous. It's less watery because this defect in this chloride channel, actually, right? But that's why they have all that congestion. That's why they have mucus buildup, and that's why they can't breathe. They have to be constantly put on kind of more forced ventilation. That's just cystic fibrosis. The other thing is smoking also paralyzes the cilia. It also causes inflammation response, which also produces that extra mucus. That's another reason why smokers have that kind of phlegmy cough. From the trachea into the bronchi, now we get into the actual lung tissue over here, right? Into the actual lung tissue, right? Where it's going to branch off and become the actual alveoli sacs, right? Eventually. Right? One continuous tract running alongside all the blood vessels that are also running alongside the lung tissue. And so here is the trachea. Here's the first two branches, and then these are the branches of the bronchi tree, right? Always know that there's other stuff going on in here. This is just like a molding or a casting of these actual bronchi tree segments. So your first ones are your main, right? Your right and your left bronchi that are going to branch off into these secondary lobar bronchi, which are going to go and break off into what are called segmental bronchi, right? Which are then going to go off into bronchi and smaller bronchi until they become what are called bronchioles. Because it's bronchiole tree going in through the lung tissue here. And so this name lobar bronchi, you notice over here, it branches into two of these blue regions of these lobar bronchi. And this lobar bronchi refers to the fact that they're going into the lobes of the lung, right? So here are the three lobes of the right lung, the two lobes of the left lung. And so you have a superior lobe, you have an inferior lobe, and then you have on the right side, you have a middle lobe, which is not shown, not there on the left lobe, right? And the reason you'll get is that the heart is kind of within this area right here. So this has two lobes, this has three. Right? And so what you call the costal surface is enclosed by the rib cage right here, right? The thorax cavity. The diaphragmatic surface is connected to the diaphragm, right? And then the inside is going to be connected to either the pericardium or the mediastinum over here, right? So and then the apex is sitting up here, right above your, just poking out above your collarbones, right? And then the base is going to be attached down to your diaphragm right here. And then just this region is where the heart is sitting. It has the cardiac notch, is what it's called, that kind of indent where the heart sits. And so before we go on into the lungs here, we want to mention this other structure, right? Those pleural cavities, which we talked about in the beginning. Right? Those are those sacs, those fluid-filled sacs that were kind of creating this space around the lungs, right? And so the lungs, the parietal membrane was attached to the rib cage area, and then the visceral pleura, that other part of the membrane, was attached to the lung tissue itself. In between them, you had that pleural cavity that was lined with fluid. Right? That fluid is going to connect these two membranes, right? And so that when these ribs pull out, it's going to pull the lungs along with them, right? Because there's that friction of that sealing because of the water friction in between them, the fluid friction in between them is going to pull out the lungs with it, right? So this is a very important part. These sacs are a very important part of your breathing apparatus, right? And it's shown if you get some kind of breakage in this from pneumothorax, right, or a sucking chest wound from like some kind of penetration of this, the seal is broken, so that when the person breathes in, the thoracic cavity exchange occurs, air comes in here and kind of fills the space in between the lung tissue and the parietal pleura, right? So once that's breached, your lungs are not getting pulled out, right? That's pneumothorax, right? And so I just want to show you real quick these dissection right here of that, just to understand, right? This has been the femororal pectoralis major. This is your, the lining of the rib cage right here.
This, if you can, you should try and get your fingers within the hole and peel the layer of tissue, the parietal pleura, away from its attachment to the inside of the rib cage so that you can leave as much of that intact as possible as you remove the bones. Now let's go ahead and take away the ribs and the intercostal muscles on each side, and you'll get an idea of what you're going to see once you've completed that part of the dissection. Now we do have some holes within the parietal pleura here, but you can see essentially what it's going to look like. There are some areas that are thinner, almost transparent, and some areas that are pathological in this individual where they've thickened up, probably because of some sort of infection within the sac surrounding the lung. This would be the parietal pleura, the outer layer of the sac that surrounds and protects the lungs. If we take that away, you can see the nice, delicate visceral pleura that's immediately on the surface of the lung, and we'll have a nice friction-free movement as the lung fills with air and then releases it during exhalation.
So the other main point, right, that's fluid filled, but also, she already removed the parietal pleura from the overlying rib cage, right? So that's the connection, why your lungs actually are being pulled out during that whole inhalation process right there, right? So I just thought that was cool, just, to kind of give you, lining of the importance of that parietal sac right there, right? So, because usually you'll just look at these kind of pictures with the lung exposed, right? And so actually what you normally would see on the outside over here, that'll be the visceral pleura, right? If you can see anything, you're not actually looking at air sacs, it'll be the visceral pleura. But here we're looking at the medial side of the lung, right? Where you have what is called the hilum. Over here, this is where the bronchi are going to enter the lungs. This is where all the major pulmonary vessels are going to also enter alongside with it before they branch off inside the lung tissue. Right? You can see the cardiac impression where the heart's sitting. You can also see the groove where the aorta, right? Where the aortic arch, your descending aorta is over here, right? These are other major blood vessels. But again, the apex is on the top, the superior portion. Your base is where it's connected to the diaphragm over here, right? You can also see the inferior, middle, superior lobe and these fissures, right? The horizontal one that both of them have, and the oblique one, that both of them have, and then the horizontal one that you see in the right lung. So the hilum, though, is that entranceway into the lungs. And you'll also see this in the kidneys. There's a hilum for the kidneys, for the ovaries, right? Where this is basically where blood vessels and stuff enter and exit the organ. So here is a kind of colored view where, remember we talked, here's the lobes, but you could also see within each lobe, you have those segments, right? So you have the lobar bronchi, the segmental bronchi, which we're going into individual segments within the lobe. And so this is interesting because these are all compartments, basically, which actually can be, it's a source of stemming the infection. If you got an infection in this lobe, it's not necessarily going to spread to this lobe. I mean, it could, but there is some containment, right? If you have cancer in this one, this can be removed without affecting the surrounding areas, right? So not only do you got the lobe compartments, within the lobes, you got these segmental compartments, right? And again, what you normally look at in these cartoons is the pictures of maybe the bronchi tree or the alveoli. And what you can't see is all that connective tissue, right? Dense connective tissue of the, forming these structures as well as in between everything else, right? So you look at a picture more like this, but in between it, you got loose connective tissue. You got these septa over here that are forming these individual little segments over here. And then you got this compartmentalization, right? So that this can be kind of confined from the surrounding other segments, which will help in kind of steadying spread of, cancer, diseases and stuff like that. And, relates to the fact that you could actually remove a particular PCL lung, and it's not like one big air balloon that's going to be affecting the whole lung. It'll affect your overall breathing, and there could be other problems, but they are compartmentalized little segments. Right? That's what this is showing, right? These are the bronchi trees, and the different colors are calling those bronchi pulmonary segments. You don't have to know any of the particulars, just know that they're little compartments. So that is your trachea leading into the bronchi of the lungs, which is going to branch off into smaller and smaller branches, and soon we're going to leave this macroscopic world of the respiratory tract. So that's a plastic cast, and all that's visible to the naked eye. Here's a cast of the bronchial tree made of clotted blood that was coughed out of a very ill patient's lungs. You can see the ruler up there. It's about 6 inches for scale. So that's the very visible part, and soon they're going to branch off into smaller and smaller branches. So the pathway through the conducting zone with the conditioning and filtering of air is going to lead to the end game, where gas exchange is going to take place at the microscopic level, and that's going to be the subject of the next video. See you next time.